They didn't raise their voices. That's what hurt the most. I keep replaying that moment, the way my mother's words fell like stones into still water. It's better if you leave tonight, quietly. She couldn't even look at me when she said it. Just stared at her hands, folded neatly in her lap like she was praying for strength, or maybe praying for me to disappear without making it harder than it already was. My father stayed seated at the dining table, his fork scraping against the ceramic plate with that awful grinding sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Like he was trying to erase something that couldn't be erased. I asked if I'd done something wrong, if I had embarrassed them, if there was still a way to make things right. But silence answered louder than words ever could. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time? Is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes when everything feels quiet and heavy, it helps to know someone else is listening. I pack slowly, as if folding time back into the seams of my clothes. Every creak of the suitcase zipper felt like a scream in the empty hallway. 23 years of living in that house, and it took me 40 minutes to pack everything that mattered. Isn't that strange? How small a life can become when you're trying to fit it into 2 suitcases? No hugs, no tears. Just the door clicking shut behind me like the final period on a sentence I never got to finish writing. They said it was temporary. They said it was for my own good. But I saw the relief in their eyes. The way my mother's shoulders dropped when I finally walked out. The way my father's jaw unclenched for the first time in weeks. They didn't want a daughter who had survived what I did. Not after the trial. Not after the whispers that followed me through grocery stores and coffee shops like smoke I couldn't wash out of my hair. It was easier for them to erase me than to defend me. I found shelter in a room that smelled of old carpet and borrowed privacy. Mrs. Chen, my landlady, asked no questions when I showed up with red eyes and everything I owned. She just handed me the key and said rent was due on the 1st. Sometimes, kindness comes without commentary, and I was grateful for that silence. The first silence in months that didn't feel like judgment. Nights were long in that small room. I replayed their words over and over. Quietly. Better. Tonight. As if I were a stain on their pristine lives. As if speaking my name too loud might make it stick to them. Might remind their friends and neighbors that they had raised a daughter who refused to stay quiet when terrible things happened to her. The trial had ended 3 months before that dinner. 3 months of waiting for them to say they were proud of me for speaking up, for finding my voice when it mattered most. Instead, they counted the days until the newspapers stopped calling, until the neighbors stopped staring, until they could pretend none of it had ever happened. But I had happened. What happened to me had happened. And no amount of their strategic silence could change that. Time moved differently in that little room. Days blended into each other like watercolors in rain. I found work at a small marketing firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, just enough to pay Mrs. Chen and buy groceries that I ate alone while listening to the couple next door argue about whose turn it was to take out the trash. Normal problems. Problems that didn't make headlines or require lawyers or leave families fractured like dropped mirrors. I didn't reach out to my parents. I didn't beg to return. I let their silence build its monument in me, brick by brick, until I understood that some distances are meant to be permanent. But while they built their monument, I built something else. I started writing, at first anonymously. Pieces about survivors, about shame that isn't ours to carry, about how society punishes victims who refuse to break silently. It was like draining venom from my own veins, word by word. Each sentence was a small rebellion against the quiet they had demanded of me. I wrote about the way trauma reshapes a family, how some people gather closer around the wounded, while others step back as if pain might be contagious. I wrote about the particular cruelty of being abandoned by the people who taught you that family was supposed to be unconditional. I submitted essays to small publications, op-eds to local papers. Anything that might let me speak when speaking felt impossible. Most came back with polite rejections. Too personal, they said. Too raw. Not quite what we're looking for. But one of them reached someone who didn't flinch. Sarah Martinez, senior editor at the Tribune, called on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee that had gone cold. Her voice was steady, professional, but underneath I heard something else. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. "I read your piece about institutional silence," she said. "The one about how families can become part of the system that silences survivors." My hands shook as I held the phone. "Thank you for reading it. I want to run it, but I want more. I want your full story, with your name, your photo, your voice." The request hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could already hear my mother's sharp inhale, my father's disapproving silence. I could see the way they would look at each other across their morning coffee. That look that said, "See, we were right to make her leave." But then I thought, they told me to disappear, to go quietly. Maybe it was time I did the opposite, not out of revenge, but out of reclamation. "I need to think about it," I told Sarah. "Of course. But let me ask you something. Whose permission are you waiting for?" The question stayed with me for days. I walked the streets of my neighborhood, past the coffee shop where the barista knew my order but not my story, past the park where children played while their parents watched with the careful attention of people who believed they could protect their children from everything. Whose permission was I waiting for? I had asked for my parents' permission to speak up during the trial. They had said it would be better if I handled things quietly, privately. I had asked for their permission to press charges. They had worried about what people would think, what it would do to our family's reputation. I had asked for their permission to heal out loud, to refuse to carry shame that wasn't mine. They had asked me to leave quietly instead. I called Sarah back on Friday afternoon. "I'll do it," I said. "I'll tell my story." The interview took place in a small conference room that smelled like coffee and old books. Sarah's questions were careful, but direct. She didn't ask me to relive every detail of what had happened. She asked me to talk about what came after. The silence. The isolation. The way being a victim became a full-time job that no one wanted to acknowledge. "What was the hardest part?" she asked. I thought about that dinner. About the way my parents couldn't look at me when they asked me to leave. The hardest part was realizing that the people who raised me to have a voice were the same people who wanted me to lose it. When the photographer arrived, I almost changed my mind. There's something permanent about having your picture taken for a newspaper. It's not like social media, where you can delete things or change your mind. It becomes part of the record. Part of history. "How do you want to be seen?" the photographer asked. I thought about all the ways I had been seen over the past year, as a victim, as a problem, as someone who couldn't let things go. I want to be seen as someone who survived. The article would run in the Sunday edition, Sarah told me. Prime real estate in the paper, the issue that people saved and shared and talked about over breakfast. I had 2 weeks to prepare myself for whatever came next. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone except Mrs. Chen, who nodded when I explained that there might be reporters calling, that things might get complicated for a while. "Sometimes complicated is the only way forward," she said, and I thought about how much wisdom lived in the spaces between her words. The night before the article came out, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that dinner, about the way my parents had made their choice to protect themselves instead of their daughter. I kept thinking about all the other daughters who had been asked to leave quietly, to disappear rather than disrupt the peace that their families had built on silence. Had been quiet for so long. It was time to be loud. The morning it came out, I didn't rush to the newsstand. I didn't need to. A friend texted me a picture at 7:23 a.m. There it was, my face, solemn and steady, on the front page of the Sunday Tribune. The headline wasn't sensational. It was honest. Breaking the silence. One woman's journey from family rejection to finding her voice. My photograph looked back at me from her phone screen, not the broken girl my parents had asked to leave, but someone who had learned the difference between being quiet and being silenced. By noon, I had 7 missed calls from home. I let them ring. Each buzzing phone call felt like a small earthquake, tremors of a world shifting beneath feet that had grown comfortable with the ground they stood on. My mother's number appeared again and again on my screen, followed by my father's, then numbers I didn't recognize, probably relatives who had suddenly remembered they had opinions about my life. That afternoon, while sitting in the small cafe where I had become a regular, I watched strangers pause at the newspaper rack outside. They would stop, read, sometimes glance around as if looking for someone. No one knew I was sitting 3 feet away, watching my story travel from my hands into theirs. An older woman bought a copy and sat at the table next to mine. I heard her whisper to her companion, "This is brave. This girl is brave." She didn't know that the girl she was talking about was listening, that her words were landing like seeds in soil that had been barren for too long. My aunt called that evening. Not my mother or father, my aunt, my mother's sister, who had always been the one to say what others were thinking but afraid to voice. They saw it, she said, without preamble. They didn't expect it. Of course they didn't. They thought silence was control. They forgot that silence can also echo, can build pressure, until it finds its own way out. "What did they say?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Your mother wants to know why you didn't tell them. Your father—" She paused. "Your father said it was exactly what he was afraid of." I thanked her for calling and hung up. My story wasn't theirs to censor anymore, wasn't something they could edit or approve before it went public. For the first time in over a year, I had spoken without asking for their permission. The responses came in waves over the following days. Letters to the editor, both supportive and critical. Social media messages from strangers who shared their own stories of family silence, of being asked to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. Email after email from people who said they had been waiting for someone to say what I had said. But the most powerful response came on Tuesday, when I received a call from the Survivors Advocacy Center. They wanted to know if I would consider speaking at their annual conference. 500 people. Lawyers, social workers, survivors, families learning how to support instead of silence. "We need voices like yours," the coordinator explained. "Voices that refuse to be managed or minimized." I said yes before I had time to second-guess myself. Sarah called the next day to tell me the article had been picked up by 3 other papers. "It's resonating," she said. "People are sharing their own stories now. You've started something." Hadn't meant to start anything. I had only meant to finish something. To complete the sentence that had been cut off when my parents asked me to leave quietly. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for writing what I couldn't say. My family asked me to stay quiet too. I'm 17. I'm going to show them your article." I stared at that text for a long time. 17. The same age I was when I first learned that speaking up could cost you everything you thought was stable. But this girl had something I hadn't. She had proof that staying quiet wasn't the only option. A week after the article ran, my mother left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when she was trying very hard not to say what she was really thinking. "We need to talk. This article, people are asking questions. About us. About how we handled things. I don't understand why you had to make it so public. Couldn't we have worked this out privately?" I listened to the message 3 times, then deleted it. Some conversations require 2 people who are willing to hear each other. My mother was still talking about managing the situation, controlling the narrative. She still didn't understand that there was nothing left to manage. the speaking. Engagement was scheduled for the following month. I spent weeks preparing, writing notes, then throwing them away and starting over. How do you condense a year of silence into 20 minutes of speech? How do you explain what it feels like to be abandoned by the people who taught you that family was supposed to be your safe place? The night before the conference, Mrs. Chen knocked on my door with a cup of tea and a small wrapped package. "For tomorrow," she said simply. Inside was a silver pendant, small and simple, with a single word engraved. "Brave. I was your age once," she said. Different country, different reasons, but same silence, same choice, disappear or speak. You chose to speak. The conference center was larger than I had imagined. 500 people looked like an ocean from the podium. I found Sarah in the third row, giving me a thumbs up. Next to her sat the 17-year-old who had texted me. She had driven 3 hours with her older sister to hear me speak. My hands shook as I approached the microphone. I touched the pendant at my throat and began. "My name is Rebecca Chen. I took my landlady's name when I started writing, because she taught me that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up when showing up is hard." I told them about the dinner, about the quiet request to disappear. I told them about the choice between silence and truth, about learning that sometimes the people who love you will ask you to make yourself smaller so they can stay comfortable. They asked me to leave quietly, I said near the end. And I did leave, but I never promised to stay quiet. The applause was thunderous, but what I remembered most was the silence that came after. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who wish you would stop talking, but the sacred silence of people who have been heard. After my speech, dozens of people approached me. Survivors, family members, advocates. But the conversation that stayed with me was with a middle-aged man who waited until the crowd had thinned. "Daughter," he said quietly. "Something happened to her last year. We asked her not to report it. We thought it would be easier for everyone." His eyes filled with tears. "After reading your article, after hearing you speak, I called her this morning. I apologized. I asked how I could support her now. That's when I understood. This had never been about my parents, about their approval or their regret. This had been about all the daughters who had been asked to carry shame that wasn't theirs. All the families who had chosen comfort over courage. My parents never called again after that voicemail. No apology came. No acknowledgement that they had asked their daughter to disappear rather than deal with the discomfort of supporting her. But their silence no longer felt like rejection. It felt like information. It told me everything I needed to know about who they had chosen to be. 6 months later, I moved into a larger apartment. Mrs. Chen helped me pack, insisting on wrapping my books in newspaper, including several copies of the Tribune issue with my story. "Keep these," she said. "Someday you might forget how brave you were." I kept writing. More articles, a blog, eventually a book proposal that Sarah helped me shop to publishers. The story grew beyond that first article, beyond that moment when I chose to speak instead of disappear. Sometimes I walk past my parents' house on the way to somewhere else. It looks the same. Neat lawn, drawn curtains, the kind of house where nothing unpleasant is ever discussed over dinner. I don't stop. I don't wonder what they think about the daughter who refused to stay erased. Last week, I received a letter from the 17-year-old girl who had driven 3 hours to hear me speak. She's in college now, studying journalism. She wants to write about survivors, about the families who learn to support instead of silence. "Thank you for showing me what loud looks like," she wrote. I keep that letter on my desk, next to a framed copy of the Tribune article that started everything. Sometimes people ask if I regret speaking up, if the cost was worth it. I think about my parents' empty dinner table, about the holidays I spend with chosen family instead of blood family, about the price of telling the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Then I think about that 17-year-old girl, about all the daughters who will never be asked to leave quietly because someone before them refused to disappear. They wanted me to vanish into their silence. But instead, I learned to make noise that echoed.